He weighed 600 pounds, and he had not been moved off his feet in 11 years. Not by wrestlers, not by boxers, not by the strongmen who flew in from 3 continents to try. He stood in the center of a crowded gymnasium with his arms crossed over a chest the size of a doorway, and he made the same offer he always made. $80,000 in cash to any man who could push him, pull him, or throw him off the spot where he stood. Nobody ever collected. His name has mostly been lost to the version of the story people tell now. What survived was the legend, a mountain of a man who turned his own body into a dare. He would plant his bare feet on the floorboards, settle his weight low like a building settling onto its foundation, and wait. The bet was simple. Move me and the money is yours. He had been collecting challengers for over a decade, and the floor of that gymnasium had seen a lot of grown men land on their backs. The thing you have to understand is that this was not a fight. There were no punches, no kicks, no submissions. It was a pure contest of force against immovability, and that made it so much worse for the men who tried. You could not be clever in a brawl. You could not catch him with a lucky shot. All you had to do was move a man who had decided he would not be moved, and one by one, the strongest people in the region discovered that they could not do it. The first man anyone remembers was a wrestler. A real one, with cauliflower ears and a neck like a fire hydrant, who had pinned national champions. He laughed when he saw the offer. He shook the giant's hand, dropped into his stance, and drove forward with everything he had. The crowd heard the grunt. They watched the wrestler's legs churn against the floor, his face going purple, his shoulders buried into the giant's stomach. The strong man did not move. He did not even uncross his arms. After 30 seconds the wrestler collapsed, gasping, and the giant looked down at him the way you might look at a child who had tried to push over a parked truck. Then came the power lifter who could deadlift more than 400 kilograms. He wrapped his arms around the giant's waist in a bear hug, locked his hands, and tried to lift. You could see the tendons stand out in his forearms like cables. He turned red, then white. He held it for 10 seconds before something in his lower back gave out, and he had to be carried to a chair while the giant calmly handed him a towel. That was the part that stung the most, people said. The giant was never cruel. He was worse than cruel. He was polite. He helped you up afterward. A boxer tried to muscle him into a wall and threw his shoulder out doing it. A judo black belt, a man who had spent his life learning to use other people's weight against them, tried the very throw that should have worked, and ended up flat on the mat himself, staring at the rafters and wondering what had just happened. A blacksmith with hands like vices tried to twist him off balance and could not even turn the giant's wrist. A team of 3 men tried at once. On a night the giant allowed it just to prove a point, and even 3 of them together could not budge him more than a few inches before they ran out of strength. The giant simply waited them out. That was his whole method. He did not attack. He endured. And in a contest of endurance against a 600-pound man, no normal human being on earth had ever won. There was a rhythm to the failures, and the crowd learned to read it. The newcomer would arrive full of confidence. He would size the giant up, decide that this was a soft fat man and not a real athlete, and that was always the first mistake. Underneath that enormous frame was a base of muscle built from years of doing nothing but resisting force, and a fat man who can resist 4 men at once is not a fat man at all. He is a fortress with skin. The challenger would commit, would pour himself into the effort, and somewhere around the 20-second mark his body would betray the truth that his pride had been hiding. He could not do it. Nobody could. And the giant would stand there breathing slow and even, unbothered, almost bored, until the man gave up. Word spread the way these stories always do. He became a fixture, a local myth, the man who could not be moved. People came just to watch others fail. They packed the folding chairs along the walls of that gymnasium, paid a few coins for a seat, and waited for the next fool to throw himself against the wall of muscle and learn the same lesson everyone learned. Strength has a ceiling, and the giant lived above it. $80,000 was a fortune. It was the kind of money that could change a family's life, buy a home, settle every debt a person had. And it sat there, untouched, year after year, because the giant understood something that none of his challengers did. They were all trying to beat him at his own game. They were all trying to be stronger than the strongest man any of them had ever seen. And in that game, the giant simply could not lose. He had spent 11 years rigging the contest in the most honest way possible. He had made it about the one thing in the world he was best at, and then invited everyone to lose to him at it. So the offer hardened into a kind of truth. He was unbeatable. The challenge was impossible. The money would never be claimed. People stopped seeing it as a contest and started seeing it as a law of nature, like gravity, like the tide. Parents brought their children to see it the way you might take a child to see a famous landmark, a thing that simply was and always would be. The unmovable man. The standing bet that no one would ever win. And then, on an ordinary afternoon, a young man walked into that gymnasium who weighed less than a quarter of what the giant did. He was lean. He was quiet. He moved through the crowd without drawing much attention, which was unusual for him, because this was a man who usually filled a room the second he entered it. He looked at the giant. He looked at the $80,000 stacked where everyone could see it, and he smiled. His name was Bruce Lee, and he was about to do the one thing nobody in that room believed was possible. But to understand how a 135-pound man even dared to step toward that giant, you have to understand who Bruce Lee really was. Because the world looked at him and saw a small man. They had no idea what they were actually looking at. Bruce Lee was born in a hospital in San Francisco in 1940, during the hour and the year of the dragon, which his mother always said meant something. The family moved back to Hong Kong while he was still an infant, and that crowded, electric city became the place that shaped him. The streets were narrow and loud and dense with people, and a small boy with too much energy found 100 ways to get into trouble in them. Here is the part people forget. Bruce Lee was not born tough. He was born sickly, a child his parents worried over, so frail that they gave him a protective nickname for a while to fool the spirits they believed preyed on vulnerable boys. He grew up thin and wiry and small, the kind of kid who got picked on, the kind of kid bigger boys decided to test. And Hong Kong in those years was not a gentle place to be small. The gangs were real. The rooftop fights were real. A boy either learned to defend himself or learned to keep his head down, and Bruce Lee was constitutionally incapable of keeping his head down. So he started fighting. Badly at first. He lost. He came home with split lips and torn shirts, and the losing lit something in him that never went out. He found his way to a master of a martial art built around close-range trapping and rapid hand strikes, and he threw himself into it with a focus that bordered on obsession. He practiced until his knuckles bled. He practiced in the rain on the flat rooftops above the city. He practiced when he was supposed to be doing schoolwork, when he was supposed to be sleeping, when there was nothing left in his arms to give. His family thought he was wasting himself on street nonsense. He thought he was learning the only language that the streets respected. But the thing that made him different was not how hard he trained. Plenty of people train hard. The thing that made him different was that he could not stop asking why. Why this stance and not another? Why block when you could redirect? Why meet force with force when force was the one thing a small man would always lose? While other students memorized forms and repeated them for decades, treating the old movements as sacred, Bruce Lee tore every technique apart in his mind and asked whether it actually worked, and if it did not, he threw it away. He treated his own body like a laboratory and tradition like a hypothesis that had to earn its place. He was fascinated by efficiency above everything. The shortest distance between 2 points. The least wasted motion. The fastest path from intention to impact. He filled notebooks with ideas and diagrams, sketches of angles and leverage, pages of philosophy mixed with anatomy. He studied not just how to hit, but how the human body balanced, where its weak points hid, how a structure that looked solid could be undone if you understood where its foundation was thin. He read everything. He watched boxers and fencers and wrestlers from every tradition, stealing whatever worked and discarding whatever was just ceremony. He was assembling a way of moving that belonged to no single school, because he had decided that loyalty to a style was loyalty to its limitations. When he came to America for university, he carried all of this with him. He studied philosophy at college, which surprised people who only saw the fighter, and the two halves of him fed each other. Eastern ideas about flow and yielding poured into his understanding of combat. Western logic poured into his training. He began to teach students of every size and background, which was controversial in a world where many believed the old arts should stay closed to outsiders. Bruce did not care about tradition for its own sake. He cared about what was true, and he was willing to make enemies to prove it. And the truth he kept arriving at, again and again, was that strength was overrated, not useless. He was deceptively powerful for his size, with a famous trick of knocking grown men backward off a chair using a punch thrown from a single inch away. The power did not come from his arm. It came from his whole body snapping into one coordinated instant, every part of him arriving at the target at the same time. That was the secret he kept circling back to. Power was not about how big the muscle was. It was about coordination, timing, and the intelligent use of the body as a single connected system. A strong man pushes. A smart man redirects. A strong man relies on his muscles. A smart man relies on physics, on timing, on the precise moment when an opponent's own weight becomes a weakness instead of a weapon. People underestimated him constantly, and he let them. He had been the small kid his whole life, the one bigger men sized up and dismissed. He had watched the calculation happen in 1,000 sets of eyes. This little guy, what could he possibly do? And then, again and again, he had shown them exactly what he could do, and watched the calculation rearrange itself into something closer to fear. He had learned that being underestimated was not an insult. It was an advantage. A man who thinks he has already won has stopped paying attention. So when Bruce Lee looked at a 600-pound man who had never been moved, he was not seeing the same thing the crowd saw. The crowd saw a wall. Bruce saw a structure. And every structure, no matter how massive, has a point where its balance lives. Find that point, apply force at exactly the right angle and exactly the right moment, and even a mountain can be tipped. The giant thought the contest was about strength. Bruce already knew it was about something else entirely. The only problem was that nobody else in that room agreed. And when word got out that the small man intended to try, the laughter started almost immediately. It rolled through the gymnasium like a wave. People turned to look at him, then turned to each other, grinning, certain they were about to watch the most lopsided humiliation the place had ever seen. A man in the front row called out that the little guy had wandered into the wrong building. Someone else shouted that the giant might not even feel him, that he should bring a friend, that he should bring 10 friends. The giant himself, hearing the commotion, uncrossed his arms for the first time, looked down at Bruce from his full towering height, and laughed too. A deep, slow, rumbling laugh that filled the room and shook the windows. He told Bruce, kindly, the way he said everything, that there was no shame in walking away. Strong men twice his size had failed. Why embarrass himself in front of all these people? Bruce did not flinch. That was the first thing people noticed, and later it was the thing they remembered most. He looked up at the giant, completely calm, and said he would like to take the bet. The room laughed harder. The giant shrugged. $80,000 was $80,000, and it was not as if he was worried about losing it to a man who looked like he could be knocked over by a strong breeze. But the people who loved Bruce, the few who had come with him, were not laughing. They were worried. They pulled him aside, away from the crowd, and lowered their voices. They told him this was madness. They reminded him that this was not a fight where his speed and his striking mattered. There were no strikes allowed, no kicks, no clever combinations. It was just push, pull, or throw, raw mechanics against raw mass, and against 600 pounds of trained immovability. None of those seemed possible. One of them said the thing everyone was thinking. You cannot outmuscle that. Nobody can. You are going to get hurt, and you are going to look foolish doing it." And Bruce smiled because that was exactly the point. He had no intention of outmuscling anyone. He explained it quietly, the way he explained things when he was certain, the way a teacher explains something he has already turned over in his mind 100 times. The giant, he said, had built his entire reputation on one assumption: that the contest was about force. Every man who had failed had accepted that assumption before he even touched him. They had walked in trying to be stronger than the strongest living man, and so they had lost before they even started. They were playing the giant's game on the giant's terms, and the giant had been perfecting that game for 11 years. Bruce was not going to play that game at all. He talked about water. It was an idea that ran through everything he believed, and the people around him had heard him say it before, but never with the stakes this high, never with $80,000 and a 600-pound man involved. Water, he said, is the softest thing in the world. You can put your hand straight through it without resistance. It yields to anything, and yet water carves canyons out of solid rock. It sinks ships and swallows coastlines. It is the most powerful force on the planet, and it is powerful precisely because it does not resist. It does not meet force with force. It finds the path, it flows around what is hard, and it applies itself exactly where the hardness is weak. The river does not argue with the boulder. It simply goes around it, and given enough time, it wears the boulder down to sand. A wall, he said, is only strong if you hit it where it is strong. The giant was a wall. But even a 600-pound man stands on 2 feet. Even a mountain rests on a base. And the base, Bruce had already seen, was the whole secret. The giant did not win by being heavy. He won by being balanced. He distributed that enormous weight perfectly, sank it low, anchored it, and turned himself into a single solid mass that force simply spread across and dissipated. As long as his balance held, he was unmovable. The instant his balance broke, all of that weight would stop being his greatest asset and become his greatest enemy. 600 pounds is impossible to push. But 600 pounds that has already started to fall is impossible to stop. The very thing that made him unbeatable was the thing that would bring him down, if a man was patient enough to wait for it. The crowd did not hear any of this. They only saw a small man talking quietly to his friends while the giant stretched and joked and accepted the congratulations of people who were already certain how this would end. The wager was made official. The $80,000 was brought out and stacked on a table near the wall in plain view so everyone could see it was real, so everyone could feel the weight of what was on the line. A space was cleared in the center of the floor. People crowded closer, leaning in, and the room, which had been loud, began to go quiet, because something about the small man's calm was starting to unsettle people who had expected him to be afraid. Fear they understood. Confidence in a man that size made no sense. He was not afraid. He was studying. As the giant took his position and planted those enormous feet on the worn floorboards, Bruce watched him the way a chess player watches a board several moves ahead. He watched where the weight settled. He watched the angle of the ankles, the set of the knees, the small shift of the hips, the way the giant leaned almost imperceptibly back onto his heels when he braced, expecting, as always, to be pushed. Every challenger pushed. For 11 years, every single one of them had pushed. The giant's entire stance was built around that one certainty. He braced backward against the forward force he knew was coming, loading his weight onto his heels in anticipation, and that backward brace had never once failed him because the assumption behind it had never once been wrong. Bruce saw it. He saw the assumption built into the giant's body, the habit 11 years deep, the trap the giant had unknowingly set for himself. And he understood, in that moment with perfect clarity, exactly what he was going to do. The referee, such as he was, a nervous man who had been pulled from the crowd, asked if both men were ready. The giant nodded, arms crossed again, that patient little smile back on his face. Bruce nodded too, and rolled his shoulders once, loose and easy, and the room held its breath. Bruce stepped in, and to everyone's confusion, he did exactly what the giant expected him to do. He set his shoulder against the giant's midsection, planted his feet, and pushed. He pushed forward, straight into the brace, the same direction every failed challenger had pushed before him. The giant felt it, that familiar forward pressure, and did what he had done 11 years worth of times without ever once having to think about it. He leaned back into his heels and absorbed it. He let the small man strain against him. He even chuckled, a low sound deep in his chest, because the push was so much weaker than the wrestlers had been, so much lighter than the powerlifters. This was nothing. This was a child pushing a truck. This was almost insulting. The crowd started to laugh again, relieved, the tension breaking, certain now that they had been right all along and that the strange calm small man was going to fail like all the rest. He strained for a few seconds, his face tightening with apparent effort, his feet scrabbling for purchase, and the giant settled deeper into his heels, fully committed now, his entire 600 pounds braced backward against the push, every ounce of him leaning into the resistance. And that was the exact instant Bruce had been waiting for, because the giant was now leaning back. All of that weight, all 600 pounds of it, was loaded onto his heels, committed in one direction, braced against a force that was about to disappear. The giant was not standing in balance anymore. He was holding himself up against a push. And a man holding himself up against a push has given away his secret without knowing it. He is no longer immovable. He has made himself dependent on the very pressure he is resisting. Take the pressure away, and there is nothing holding him up. Bruce stopped pushing. He did not just stop. He reversed. In one fluid motion, faster than the crowd could follow, faster than the giant could react, he dropped his weight low, hooked both hands behind the giant's braced knees, and yanked hard in the same direction the giant was already leaning. He did not fight the 600 pounds. He joined it. He added his own force to the giant's own momentum, became part of the fall the giant had already begun. He became water. He found the direction the mountain was already tipping, and he poured everything he had into it at exactly the right angle at exactly the right moment. For one frozen second, nothing seemed to happen. The whole room hung suspended. And then the impossible began. The giant's heels, loaded with all that backward weight, lost their grip on the floor. There was nothing pushing against him any more to hold him upright, and his enormous body, braced against a force that was no longer there, kept going in the only direction it could go. Backward. The same balance that had made him unbeatable now made him completely helpless, because once a mass that size starts to tip past its center, no amount of strength in the world can call it back. There is not a muscle in the human body strong enough to reverse 600 pounds in motion. His arms flew out. His eyes went wide. The patient little smile fell off his face and was replaced by something nobody in that gymnasium had ever seen on him before in 11 years. Surprise. Then alarm. Then the simple animal understanding that he was going down and there was nothing he could do about it. 600 pounds hit the floorboards with a sound like a tree falling in a forest. The whole building shook. Dust jumped off the rafters and drifted down through the light. A folding chair against the wall tipped over from the vibration. And for one long moment the entire room was so completely silent that you could hear the giant breathing where he lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling he had never expected to see from that angle. Bruce Lee was already standing back, calm, barely winded, looking down at the man who had not been moved in 11 years. He had not pushed him over. He had not outmuscled him. He had not done a single thing that required him to be stronger than anyone. He had let the giant defeat himself. He had simply redirected 600 pounds of force that the giant had generated all on his own, turned the man's greatest strength into the instrument of his fall. The strongest man any of them had ever seen had been brought down by the lightest man in the room, and the weapon had been his own weight the entire time. It had always been there. 11 years of challengers had been standing right next to the answer and never once seen it because they were all too busy trying to be strong. The silence broke all at once, and it broke like a dam. The gymnasium erupted. People were on their feet, shouting, climbing over the folding chairs, pointing, grabbing each other. because they understood that they had just watched something rewrite a rule they had believed was permanent. The unmovable man had moved. The impossible bet had finally been collected. And it had been collected not by a stronger giant, not by a team of men, not by some freak of nature, but by a small quiet man who had refused to play the game that everyone else had lost. The giant, to his enormous credit, did not rage. He did not accuse Bruce of cheating, though some in the crowd were already shouting that he must have. He sat up slowly on the floor where he had landed, shook his head once to clear it, and for a long moment he just looked at Bruce, studying him the way you study something you do not yet understand. Then, the way he had always helped his fallen challengers to their feet, he began to laugh. Not the mocking laugh from before. A real one, full and surprised and almost grateful. The laugh of a man who had spent 11 years being right about one thing and had just been shown a deeper truth that he had never once considered in all that time. He had thought the contest was about who was stronger. He had never imagined, not for a single second, that it could be about who understood the contest better. He got to his feet, all 600 pounds of him, crossed the floor, and held out his enormous hand. Bruce took it, and the giant told the men by the table to give the small man his money. Bruce took the $80,000. But the money was never really the point, and everyone who tells this story understands that. The point was the lesson, and the lesson is the reason a 135-pound man stepping toward a 600-pound giant is still worth talking about all these years later, long after both men are gone and the gymnasium is dust. The giant was not beaten by force. He was beaten by an idea, and the idea was the same one Bruce Lee spent his entire short life trying to teach anyone who would listen. Do not meet hardness with hardness. Do not try to overpower what you cannot overpower. Find the angle. Find the moment. Use what your opponent gives you instead of fighting it. The strongest force in the world is not the one that resists. It is the one that flows, that yields, that waits with perfect patience for the exact instant when a mountain has committed itself to falling, and then helps it on its way. Be water, he liked to say. Empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless, like water. You put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. You put it into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You put it into a teapot, it becomes the teapot. Water can flow or it can crash. Be water. And the giant on that floor had just learned, in the hardest possible way, what happens to a man who builds his whole life and his whole identity on being solid, when he finally comes up against a man who has learned to be water. There is a deeper truth buried in this legend, and it has nothing to do with martial arts at all. Every one of us, at some point, comes face to face with our own version of that giant. Something that looks immovable, a problem too big to solve, an obstacle too heavy to lift, a wall we have already decided in advance that we cannot get past. And the instinct almost always is to push, to meet the thing head-on, to throw all of our strength against the part of it that is strongest, and to exhaust ourselves completely the way every failed challenger exhausted himself against that 600-pound wall. We lose most of the time not because we are weak, but because we are playing the wrong game entirely. We are trying to be stronger than something that will always be stronger than us. Bruce Lee won because he asked a different question. Not how do I become stronger than this thing, but where is this thing strong and where is it not? Not how do I force my way through, but where is the path already trying to open? The giant's greatest strength, his perfect immovable balance, the very thing that had made him a legend, was also the precise thing that destroyed him, because Bruce was patient enough to wait for the giant to commit, and wise enough to use that commitment instead of fighting against it. The obstacle handed him the solution. The obstacle always does, if you are looking for it instead of just lowering your head and pushing. Bruce Lee did not live long. He was gone at 32, far too soon, with so much of what he was building left unfinished. His greatest work still ahead of him. But the ideas survived him completely, and they survived precisely because they were never really about fighting at all. They were about how to move through a hard and heavy world without breaking yourself against it. Stay soft. Stay adaptable. Stay awake to the moment when force can become leverage. Stop trying to be the immovable mountain, because mountains, in the end, are exactly the things that get tipped over by the patient water at their base. Be the water that finds its way around them, and through them, and eventually past them. So the next time you stand in front of your own giant, the thing you have already decided you cannot move, remember the small quiet man who walked into that gymnasium full of laughter and simply smiled. Remember that he did not win by being stronger than the problem. He won by being smarter than it, by being calmer than it, by understanding it more deeply than the problem understood itself. And remember that the most unmovable force you will ever face in your life is almost always just one good angle and one patient moment away from falling. If you are calm enough to wait for it, if you are wise enough to see it, and if you are willing, when the moment finally comes, to stop pushing and start flowing. If the story moved you the way it moved everyone in that gymnasium that day, there is another one you need to hear. The story of the moment Bruce Lee proved this exact philosophy against an opponent who actually fought back, with everything on the line and his entire reputation at stake. It is on the screen right now. Go watch it.